I am recording this session. So here is the regional pastors part of our conversation for today. And we're just opening the mic up for anybody to chime in. So I'm going to turn myself off for a second and invite you to speak into what we've offered to you today already.
Well, I'll just start, Dave, with a comment and then maybe a question that I'd love to hear from others. Yeah, I think the 8 points are right on, and I've really experienced most of them in dealing with, not all, but with different pastors. But I also think you guys provide some great resources, not only was highlighted here, but others. And I found one of my goals in when I'm meeting with some of our pastors is to call attention to it. And I think part of the information overload of our world is that there's great stuff there, and I don't know if they know it. And even getting them to go to it has not always been that easy. I don't know if anybody else has discovered that, but that's and so this is helpful because I've tried then personally to identify some things. But is that something others have experienced, and how have you dealt with that?
I'll chime in on the Article 17 stuff because unfortunately we just went through an Article 17 and I found it very helpful that I downloaded everything, put it in sequence, and then sent it out to the people who were participating in the Article 17. I find the way that it has been rewritten, reframed, very good. That it's more about the call coming to an end rather than a confrontational conflict that we're dealing with. So that's very good. Appreciated it.
Thanks, Henry. Just a little note that article, Article 17, as well as the other release, Article 14, is undergoing some study these days. This is a synodical study committee trying to sort through a lot of the overtures that had come to this past summer synod relative to those two articles, as well as 12 and 13. So there's some work being done on those, and of course that will eventually get reflected in the website as well. Thoughts?
This is just something that we recognized as I'm part of our class's interim committee, and we recognize that following Synod's decision, that there was a lot of a variety of feelings, the way that people felt in light of the decision related to the human sexuality report. And so we had an open gathering of pastors and leaders from churches, and people could Zoom. And we just first asked pastors to talk about how their church felt in light of it, and went around the circle, and everybody that was there participated. And then we asked the pastors how they felt, what some of their feelings, and everybody listed it. And then finally, we asked about how it would impact how we functioned as a classis, given that the responses and the way we felt were very different. And across the board, two things happened. One is that classis, everybody there said, we don't want it to get in the way of our classis ministry, what we partner in already. And that was important because we were concerned about whether we would have a classis meeting in which some church wouldn't seat or wouldn't recognize delegates from other churches depending on their positions. And then that we were not going to discuss churches' positions at classes, that we just weren't going to make that part of our classes meeting. And I just want to say it was really helpful because it was a way to just air these feelings. And what we ended up with is across the board, pastors and churches across the board were dissatisfied. Just like their last sort of description of how they felt about it was, regardless of which position you had, was dissatisfied, like it was unfinished, it wasn't settled, it was. So anyway, I just wanted to share that as part of what we did to care for pastors and to care for churches.
Thanks, John. That conversation just sounds so valuable and helpful. And I wonder if there are others in other classes who did similar things, provided that kind of forum for conversation, so that the conversations that really get to that issue didn't have to take place on the floor of a class's meeting, but had another area, another time, another space for them. I just wonder if there were others who did similar things.
And let me just add that we announced ahead of time, you know, when we sent out the invitation, that we were not going to discuss human sexuality. We were not going to discuss the report or our positions. We were going to talk about our feelings, which is not very, that's not very like us Stoic Dutch people to talk about feelings, but it actually worked. We actually did it. So just that.
So it turns out people, A, had feelings, and B, felt free to share them.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
Would that work in other settings, everybody? Or is that something that would be worth doing? What do you think?
Dave, this is Brian Oxner, Central Plains. We did something similar even as we were receiving the report. You wouldn't believe it here in Pella, but we did. It was called Pastors and Scotch. So if you were willing to, you'd come to the local house of ill repute / pub house, whatever it might be, and we joined around a glass of scotch, and we reflected on where we were at. You know, not necessarily the theology of it, but how we were receiving it, how we were processing it, how were we leading in it, how was it being received in our churches. So and we've continued that conversation more on informal basis. I know as a regional pastor, I've wrestled with several of our area pastors and what this means. So it's happening on a much more informal level. So we've never really done it on a bigger scale. As a gentleman from Northern Illinois there. If I can come back to just a comment earlier, the original question that was posed about the resource or information overload. It's interesting. I found I had this same conversation with Trudy Ash, our regional catalyst for faith formation, and I just expressed my great appreciation for all the resources, but there's so much there that it's so hard to wade through. And when people get to that website or whatever it may be, if they eventually get there, there's just so much to wade through. So I had a conversation with her about what would it look like to do some sort of monthly ministry moment. I don't know, somehow differently than how it's being done right now to get some of those resources back out in front of the church. So, yeah, unfortunately, I don't know most of you, but I think it was John who had mentioned that. And I think there just has to be a better way in which it's both getting into the forefront of our minds as regional pastors, but then how do we communicate those resources more succinctly to the members of our local classes. So that to me is just one of the biggest pieces with all of the rich resources that the CRC has, wading our way through it and getting the right information to the right people. So I don't know what that looks like. That's just a challenge that I experience here.
Let me raise a question. One of the things I've thought about, and again, was wondering how proactive to be, but would be a one-page something that I have thought to mail or email to each of the pastors and elders and maybe even deacons every month, just to pick out some kind of a something. One of the things I had mentioned recently is to catch. A good teacher once said, you know, what makes you a great teacher? And she said, my goal is to catch somebody doing something good. And so at the last classes meeting, I had highlighted some of those kinds of things. Again, just as a way of reinforcing helpful behavior, but also of spreading, oh, really? Oh, I didn't know that, you know, kind of a thought. And so as part of my reported classes, that's something of what I do. It's less trouble oriented and more proactive kinds of stuff. And I thought to extend that to those who aren't at classes into some kind of a just one page, once a month kind of a something. But how best to distribute that is always the question. So anyway, do any of you do anything like that? Is that, I don't know what out of bounds is in this kind of deal.
I can jump in with a suggestion here. So
Yeah,
Brian mentioned Trudy's role, and each region of the CRC, we've got it kind of broke up into 6 regions, has what's called a regional connector. So Trudy is that for kind of the Midwest of the US, but there are others. And I know they would love to have good relationships with all of you, really any classes functionaries. And if you wanted to put something together like Larry was talking about, you could contact them. They could help you put that together, give you some suggestions for, you know, ask you some of the questions, what's going on in your classes, and help match some resources to that. They could also, you know, just help you kind of just think through the process of communicating and things like that. So I know they'd all be very happy to do that. And Trudy would actually, she's the team lead for that group now. So she could be somebody that can point you to your regional connector if you don't know who that is already. Or any of us could, at the CRC could really do that. So.
Rudy was at our recent classes meeting and did a fine job. So it's just good.
One thing I'd like to mention, or in connection with this conversation and communication, in Eastern Canada, at least the western side of Eastern Canada, we have had a long history of monthly gatherings of pastors. We call it peer group. It used to be intern house, and it's been happening. I've been here 13 years. It's been happening much longer than that. We get probably 70–80% participation of the pastors in this part of classes each month coming out. And some years we have funding from PCR. This year we have funding to support a book we can go through and some retreat time. Even without funding, the pastors come consistently, and it's a place to relax, to share, to connect, to get to know each other. And it's reflected in the discussions that happen at classes, the respect that we have for each other at classes, because we know each other and we understand each other. And I hear some conversation about formal settings and formal conversations that need to happen, but to have that monthly gathering is a huge step to an understanding and respect that we have for one another in our classes, and working together, even with the differences that we may have in our ideas. We know each other beyond just theology. We know each other as persons and colleagues. And so I don't know how many other classes have that opportunity. As a regional pastor, I do encourage it, but it doesn't take a lot of effort to encourage, because people really look forward to coming out. And tomorrow is our next one, and we're looking forward to it. So just want to highlight that regular gathering of pastors.
All right. Just let me just say amen to that. We've got I'll call it 2.5, two regularly, almost monthly groups. One group is a monthly, the other one's semi-monthly, and the other's occasional. But the one of which I'm a part in classes, and the pastors can go to any one, but they're essentially regional or geographical. Ours is called the 6 team. The reason we call it the 6 team is not military, but again, it's the idea that as in the military, if you're familiar in terms of the clock, 12 o'clock is straight ahead, 3 to your right, 9 to your left, and 6 is behind you. And we call ourselves the 6 team, not because there are 6 of us, but because I've got your 6, you got mine. And so we've actually put together a covenant that we affirm at each meeting, basically said we're stronger together. What we say is confidential, and I give you permission to ask me hard questions, but ask me in a way that allows me to respond rather than to react. Those kinds of reminders about why we're together and what we're about. And we've had just some really excellent conversations as a result of that. And then spontaneously, hey, there's something we can, one of the churches is holding a dinner. We invite our wives. And so, so it was just an informal, and a bunch of us came together with our wives, and kids, some of them, so it's just amen to that concept.
Thanks, guys. Seems like a lot of our conversation so far has been about what's really working well to bring people together, whether that's been access to resources or, thanks. Good to see you, Brian. Access to resources or conversations about human sexuality or convening pastors in a 6 team. Just makes me wonder, what other tricks do you have up your sleeves, everybody, for gathering pastors into meaningful, supportive kinds of conversations? Are there other good ideas out there that you could share with us?
Well, this is I'm Carl Crominga from Greater Los Angeles. So our classes is probably one of the most diverse and spread out, and well, I don't know about spread out, but diverse in the denomination. And so we've got people from all different cultures and backgrounds and expectations, and it's a challenge to educate people as to what it means to be part of the Christian Reformed Church. So that's just kind of, we step back, and when I hear what you other guys are doing, it's like, boy, sounds like a different planet. But we do have peer groups that have been very successful, and they're groups of pastors, about 5 or 6 pastors, and they meet monthly, and the groups talk about whatever the pastors would like to talk about. Sometimes they read a book together and base their discussions on that, but a lot of times it's just communicating the joys and challenges of ministry, and that's worked very well for us. It's hard to get the whole classes together for just about anything, including classes meetings. So the breakdown into peer groups has been, I think, essential in keeping people connected.
Carl, those peer groups, are they in any way defined or shaped ethnically or in terms of age or region? How does that go for you guys? How have you done that?
Well, one of the groups is called the Revelation 7 group. So they're very ethnically diverse and intentionally, and then the others are more geographic. Like, there's a cluster of churches in Bellflower and Artesia and Long Beach, and so those guys get together because it's easy to do. And then there's other groups that are Spanish speaking or Korean speaking, and that's I suppose that's ethnically defined or more by language than anything else. So.
Sounds terrific. Thanks, Carl. Thanks for your work in helping that to take place. That sounds beautiful.
I'm wondering if I could shift the focus a little bit more. I'm part of what you, the observations was tension within churches, tension between pastors and churches and stuff like that. And, I'm in Alberta North, and I was a regional pastor in Ontario before that. And now, and Dave, you would know that I'm part of a team of people, and I really appreciate that. We call it a Healthy Church Task Force, whereas regional pastors, we're part of a team where we kind of try to help churches to become more healthy and dealing with issues and problems within churches as a team approach. And I've really, really appreciated that, because in my previous regional pastor experience, I was kind of felt like I was a lone ranger. And now I feel like I'm part of a team approach. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. But I guess what I'm seeing, all these Article 17s and even situations could potentially lead into Article 17s. How can we help pastors and maybe even congregations in that sense, to work through some of these issues? And some of it I see is you mentioned even boundaries with pastors and stuff like that, and how that leads to all kinds of tension. How can we help pastors? In essence, in many ways, it comes back to leadership issues. How can we help them, navigate through some of these difficult situations? And I know in our classes right now, we're dealing with a number of situations that could potentially lead to an Article 17. And we're trying to help them through some of that. But boy, I don't know how that is in some of your classes, but that seems to be an ongoing issue. You put out one fire and there's a bunch of other fires that are going. I wouldn't mind hearing some feedback on that.
Maybe before we get to that, Henry, I wonder if you could say more about Classis Alberta North's Healthy Church Task Force. Who's on it, what your mandate is, and what are some of the key things that you've been able to do together?
Yeah. I think there's about 7 or 8 of us. So there's 3 regional pastors. And then we also have a couple people who specialize in doing restorative work. And so there's some trained professionals. We're also really, and then our church visitor person who's heading that up is also part of that team. So we oversee the church visiting also. We're also, and then we got a couple other people that just are really gifted. We're fortunate. We also have a guy by the name of Cecil, who's in our classes, who's a wonderful resource.
Never heard of him.
And but this team approach is just really, I have so much appreciated, as we have basically pretty well monthly meetings. And I just so appreciate being part of the team. I'm not alone. And so we try to, what's helpful too is, as a regional pastor, you can't be up on everything that's happening in every situation, every church. And sometimes we alert each other to what we hear is happening. I find it's just been a wonderful experience. I've only been doing it a little bit more than, not even quite a year now. But it's just a whole fresh new way for me to see my role as a regional pastor now.
Nice. Thanks, Henry. We are better together. And that's a team that personifies that truth really, really well. At PCR, we kind of are, we are super impressed with the nature of that team, its mandate, and the way that it carries out its work. Yeah, let's address the question, though, that you've raised, Henry. How to help pastors in contexts where a conversation in the congregation needs to happen, and there's just tension around all of that. What do you say to a pastor? How do you help that pastor? How do you equip that pastor to be who they need to be in that environment? What do you think?
If I can share just a little bit, we've had a couple different experiences like that here, and I guess I want to augment the question just a little bit if I could. Because I think it's, what do you have to ask the pastors, but what also do you have to ask the councils? So particularly, like your statement number 5, shifting expectations about the boundaries and roles of families. From the younger generation, setting more boundaries to older pastors being the everything guy. I happen to probably be the longest serving pastor in our classes right now, and I'm 42. So that's interesting to me. And in the conversations that Henry is pointing out, we've had more conversations that need to take place with our councils about actual appropriate expectations of their pastor. More so than we've had to have pastors who are needing appropriate conversations about putting in more work. If that's a fair thing to, so I guess I want to augment the conversation, not to just what do we have to be asking our pastors, but I guess I'm looking for a little bit more discernment outside of.
And I guess I would say, I don't think it's always more work. I think sometimes it's being smart in terms of the way they go about it. Like we've got a couple of situations now in our classes where I'm looking at how the pastors are dealing with some stuff. And like one example, we've got one pastor now who's had a running conflict with 3 chairs of council in a row. And I'm thinking, hang on a sec here, there's a problem, right? So how can we help these kinds of situations where it's not always how much work they're doing, but just how they're going about things, or maybe not going about things. And I see more of that. We're seeing another situation now too, where there's tension between a pastor and the council, and it's not so much a work thing as to how the pastors are approaching some things.
I really appreciate that clarification. Let's stick with his question and not the other one, because I think that's a better question. So thanks.
Can I jump in with this one? Because you both raised a question that I had scribbled down. How do we, and is it our role as regional pastors? Example, a pastor here, about 3 months ago, had just a real blow up with his council and with staff. And he was bending my ear, and I was suggesting some things. And how do we work through this structurally? Because it wasn't just him; it was just part of the structure. And no, you may not talk to my council. I will not bring you into the council. I will not have you talk with anybody. It's just me. And so I'm saying, well, I understand regional pastors, pastor of pastors, and church visitors can be called in by the council for stuff, but how do we interface? And so I'm really keying in on the Henry's team approach with church visitors. But I was almost ready to flag this issue for the church visitors, but is that my role? The council didn't call the church visitors. Whose role is it to say, hey, this is a systemic deal. It's partly structure, it's partly pastor's stuff. And he just plain, if he wouldn't, he basically bailed and got a call, and he's going to be gone. So it's like, oh, well, but anyway, that adds kind of a subtext to what you have already raised. What are the roles that we play, and how do we intervene? Because it's not only just the pastor's issue, but it's often structural and relational and perspective stuff.
Larry, you raise a good question. Do you have permission to share information with other classes functionaries? And that's a really, you can get into all kind of dicey kind of territory there, but my sense of it is, though, that you may have broader permission than you think. That it is always helpful as a regional pastor, if you hear from the church visitors, to say, hey, there's stuff going on at that church. Just want you to be aware there's stuff, and you might want to talk to the pastor. And you don't need to get specific, but you are empowered then to enter the system in a healthy way in line with your role, and vice versa for regional pastors communicating with church visitors. There's stuff going on there that I think you need to ask about. And that way you're doing the due diligence of alerting the appropriate people and not betraying any confidences, and equipping a conversation that probably needs to happen.
And probably will if I'm called in after he's gone.
Yeah.
As an English kind of deal.
Yeah, and I think in certain cases, like a couple of these cases I'm referring to too, I think some of these pastors need to be challenged with, hey, if some of this continues, this is going to lead to an Article 17. And I think sometimes maybe we just need to ask a pastor, is that the road you want to go on? And if not, well, what's it gonna take for you maybe to change some ways in which you're dealing with your leadership or looking at ministry that won't lead down that path? Because most people don't want to go there. And yet, unfortunately, it is happening over and over.
But without using the threat of Article 17, is there a different phrasing of the question? How are you building up the church? How are you learning your own abilities of ministry? Why are you responding the way you are? I appreciate what you're saying, Henry, but I'm hearing a little bit of threat there and saying, well, if you don't do this, this is going to happen. And can it be reframed into a learning type of approach that assumes a willingness to learn, which is also what I'm hearing in some of these comments is I'm right, they're wrong, period, end of discussion, the polarization we talked about in one of the points earlier. But if there's a willingness to learn some of those questions to the pastor, to the councils as well, what are we learning about this brokenness that's happening here? What are we recognizing? It's not whose fault is it, but what are we learning in this? And that, yes, could involve church visitors as well as regional pastor, not just one person.
I guess, I've always seen the regional pastor, I think Larry mentioned it earlier, as the pastor to the pastors. And having gone through some conflict in one of my churches, I really appreciated having somewhere to go to that sort of stood outside of the conflict, right? The church visitors were involved. It actually wasn't with my council, but with some members in the council, kind of between the council and the members. But I would just caution, be really careful to protect that space for the pastor. Church visitor, I would agree 100% with what Dave said about having more freedom to communicate with the church visitors, and then let them do their work and you be there to be a listening ear. I'd also say don't feel like you have to be the counselor to the pastor either. You might be the friendly voice that recommends a counselor, but most of us don't have psychological degrees and such. So that wasn't really what I was looking for a regional pastor for either. It was just another person who just kind of got it and could give me a few pieces of advice, but didn't have to wade into the situation. Allowed me to get out of the situation actually for a few moments.
Maybe now is it, just following after your comment there, Scott, a time for me to just think about what Al Postma would often say about the role of the regional pastor. And often people would think of that role as the person who is for the pastor. Kind of a general way of articulating what your role is. And he said, I think I'd like to nuance that a little bit. I'd like to say that regional pastors are, for the pastor, but more than that, they are for the pastor's health and well-being. That distinction becomes important when pastors want their regional pastors to take their side in any particular conversation. And that's not your job. Your job is to be there for the pastor's health and well-being in the context of that potentially thorny conversation. And you get to be the one who maybe asks some reflective questions of the pastor that nobody on scene is willing or able to ask. You get to do that in support of that pastor. That maybe is a way to nuance what your role is. I really appreciated that when Al mentioned that to me a few years ago. It just made sense. And help me to clarify what this regional pastor role actually is. You're free to push back on that, by the way, but that seemed to me a helpful nuance from Al.
I just want to share a reflection, and then I have a question. The reflection that when I've engaged with pastors that are in a tense spot or conflictual spot, I would often in our conversation ask them, what are you learning about yourself? That's, you know, it's a way to invite them to not get this defensive, but just to say, yeah, what are you learning about yourself? My other question is, I don't know if any of you have had conversations, but I have with pastors who are wondering whether they can stay in the Christian Reformed Church, whether the Christian Reformed Church will whether they'll be able to continue in ministry in the Christian Reformed Church. I think that's been a really hard one for me, and I wondered if others have had that. And you know, I've just been saying patience, because even though it seems like things moved really quickly at the synod, that's not typical, and all of us are waiting to see. But I don't know if others of you have had those conversations, but I have, and they're hard. They're hard. Yeah.
I did not have that conversation because the decision was made privately, I suppose, and the individual just announced the decision to leave. So I don't know how to better answer that, but I had one other thought that I wanted to share. I mean, first of all, sorry I was so late. Maybe you all understand that. I want to echo Dave's words. When I was in a situation, there wasn't a regional pastor made themselves available to me. And so the supporting my health and well-being, which would probably have said, William, I'm going to walk you through the process of having a call because it's ending. That didn't happen. So please ask the hard questions. It needs to be done, and it's an expression of love and concern.
I would just like to respond to the list and say that in Grand Rapids North, we had, when I've been in this process for 20 plus years. So I was in my 40s and kind of in the middle of the pack. And then I kept having birthdays and got older. And, you know, now I'm the old guy. But many of the churches in classes in the last 20 years saw a retiring pastor and replaced that retiring pastor with a young pastor quite close to coming out of seminary. And so the real challenge I see is we have 30-something pastors working with 60-something, 70-something maybe, elders and deacons. And so I'm just acknowledging there's this big generation issue that is challenging. However, some 30-something pastors are really skilled at interacting with people who are different than they are. And some of them are not very skilled at all, which makes me ask the question, is there really anything different, or has it always been the case that a young pastor was working with older councils? And is there something happening that just reduces the number of young pastors who've got that kind of intergenerational? Maybe it's I'm floundering there. I'll just stick with my main observation: young pastors, old councils. Well, and then what has worked for me is to be a coach, not as regional pastor, and by coaching, to try to ask good questions, give relatively little advice, and help a young pastor answer their own question of what will I do that might be more successful than what I've been doing.
I don't think age is the big issue. One thing that I've always really encouraged pastors to do is no matter how long you've been in ministry, you need to develop relationships with your key people in the church, key people in leadership. And I think if they do that, like meet some of your key leaders for lunch or for breakfast or whatever, and get, talk about things in their lives and talk about things, how are things going in the church. And I think when pastors do that, then age doesn't matter no more. And I don't always see enough of that. And we're, developing those strong relationships. And I've certainly experienced that for myself in my own ministry. When I was doing that, it made a world of difference. And it didn't matter whether they were younger or older. And so I find pastors that are doing that often end up being more effective. And a lot of it comes back to, I think, people relations. And maybe that comes easier for some than others, but I think that's a really key thing to really encourage pastors to do that.
Thanks, Henry. Thanks, John. In our experience at PCR, we are seeing generational differences that do amount to roadblocks in relationships. A younger pastor that emerges as pastor in a congregation full of council members that are just 2 or 3 generations older, and there's stuff there that's hard to talk about. But Henry, your advice is, I think, really helpful. And that is to find ways to generate those conversations, to encourage those pastors to connect with those people, even to be there with the pastor, perhaps, if that's helpful. The other thing that comes to mind, and I was meaning to jump in a little bit ago, I'm glad I didn't, but I'll do it now. And that gets back, Brian, to something that you had raised about how aware are council members of what their pastors are going through, and vice versa. How aware are pastors of what their council members experience in leadership? In the classes that I came out of, classes Georgetown, our regional pastors, we had a couple of them, sponsored 2 dialogues. One was asking pastors to tell their councils what they wish council members knew about their job. And they were asked to write that down, send it in, and Mark and Dave collated all that information in a way that councils could digest. And then they, I think, if I remember correctly, they did the same thing for council members. Those who had come to a particular council or classes meeting, they just said, we're going to give you 20 minutes to write down what you would love your pastor to know about your work as an elder or a deacon. And then they spent the next month collating that and then distributed that to the pastors in a way that they could tolerate, digest, understand. And that ended up being a very helpful exercise, because it took the exercise out of a particular issue-driven conversation and made it generic so that it was safer for people to say what they wanted to say. It was a wonderfully empowering conversation for our classes. So that's a suggestion that I would put alongside of all the other suggestions that have been offered here. And then, John, the question that you raised, such a good question. How do you equip and empower pastors in anxious environments? And I just want to offer this. One is to help them become as non-anxious as possible. And part of that is becoming self-aware. So if you're aware of a pastor who's not done the Berkman assessment, perhaps, or is not in spiritual direction or counseling, to advocate for those kinds of practices. And oh, by the way, for all of you who are regional pastors, if you've not taken the Berkman yet and are halfway, 30%, 10% interested, let us know, because we got money to do that at no cost to you. That money runs out at the end of the calendar year. So you'd be wise to kind of ring us up here pretty soon, and we'll get you scheduled. We'd love to offer that to you as a gift for you who are regional pastors, for your growth in self-awareness, so that you can become more effective in your ministry to fellow pastors and your congregations.
Good question, Dave.
Yeah, Larry.
I took that probably 20 years ago. Does it change if I would take it again and compare? I mean, is it worth doing it again?
Ooh, 20 years. Wow. So the data that they tell us about says that it does not change unless you experience a huge life transformation, like the loss of a spouse or painful ending of a particular call. Now, I've also talked with people who have taken it twice, window of time of 5 years between them, and those results come out fairly differently. So I would say it's been 20 years and it's free to you, Larry, go ahead and take it.
Might be only 15. Thank you. That's helpful.
You're welcome. Hey, it's almost 4:30. I'd like to close in prayer with all of you, dear ones. But if there's one comment that is burning in your mind, you want us to hear, now's your time.
A quick question, Dave. You've sent out some stuff about a conference in November. Can you maybe just say a little bit more what the plans are for that?
Yeah, so there are 2 more gatherings this year that are of this kind of nature. One is in October. It'll be formulated just like this one. Then there's one November the 8th. That's actually an orientation session for new regional pastors, new church visitors. And that's on top of the November pastors gathering in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which takes place the week after. And that's open to regional pastors and chaplains and all the pastors in the denomination. But the one that I think you're thinking about is that November 8th Zoom gathering. That's an orientation session for people just like you, regional pastors and church visitors. And we'll send out more information about that as we get closer to that date.
I was thinking more of the one in Albuquerque. What are kind of the plans for that? Would it be similar to some of the other conferences you've had in the past for regional pastors or what?
Yep, pretty much what we were planning for 2021, and something got in the way. I don't remember what. But anyway, we're going to do that one in 2023. Same plenary speaker, Mary Hulst from Calvin University. And we'll run some breakout sessions and so on. But same kind of format that you're familiar with if you've been to those conferences before. All right, everybody, it's 4:30. I want to honor your time. And let me just say again, thank you very, very much for your work. We treasure you as our partners on the field or in the field. We are so glad for your efforts, your diligence, your love for Jesus, your love for the church, and your love for pastors. If we can be of resource to you in any way, either Scott or myself or Sean or Zach, please don't wait to reach out. Reach out whenever you think you'd like to have a partner in conversation or in process or whatever. We want to equip you for the good work that you're called to do. Let me lead us in a closing prayer. Dear Father God, thank you so very much for the faces around this virtual table. We give you thanks for all of the equipping that you do in our lives and for our work in pursuit of our call and all for your glory. Thank you, God, for causing lines to fall in pleasant places in our lives. And thank you, God, for giving us the wherewithal to have faith when those lines aren't so pleasant. Lead us going forward into the rest of this week and this month and this year. Bless our work. We pray that you would hold closely our families and that you would lead us to reveal Jesus in all that we say and do. We give you thanks in his precious name and for his sake. Amen. Thanks, everybody. Great to see you. God bless you in your life and in your work.
Yeah.
Thank you all for the work you do.